She was 41 years old the winter they left her for dead at the bottom of Coldwater Canyon, and by every reckoning of the men who did it, she should have frozen before the moon came up. It was her husband's brother, Silas Dune, who arranged it, because the ranch outside Canyon de Piedra had come to her name when Thomas died, and Silas could not abide a widow holding what he believed his blood was owed. They took the deed, the horses, and the good rifle, and they rolled her wagon over the rim as though grief could be tidied like a spill. She had $11 sewn into her hem and a swollen ankle and a stubbornness that would not lie down. 3 days later, half-starved and moving like an old woman though she was not, she used 4 of those dollars to buy the one thing nobody in the valley wanted, a caved-in miner's dugout, and its worthless claim at the dry end of the canyon, sold to her by a bank clerk who laughed as he took the coins. It looked like the purchase of a woman who had lost her mind along with everything else. But something was sealed behind the rockfall in that dugout, something a whole generation had hunted and grieved and gone to their graves without finding. And when she finally broke through to it, it would not only lift her out of the dust, it would give a forgotten town back the thing it had lost. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Marisol Vane. If you're watching this from a place the world seems to have driven past and forgotten, a town that emptied out, or a life that got rolled over a rim by people who should have loved you, tell us in the comments where you're listening from tonight, because this story was made for you. Marisol was born in a river town in Missouri, the 4th of 6 children, to a father who mended clocks and a mother who kept bees. And if you had asked anyone in that town what the Vane children were good for, they would have told you the girls could fix anything with their hands. Her father's shop smelled of oil and brass, and by the time she was 9, she could take a stopped clock apart across a felt cloth, lay each tiny wheel and pin in the order it came out, and put it back so it kept true time again. He taught her that a thing was rarely broken all the way through, that most often a single small piece had slipped, or worn, or gone dark, and that patience with the smallest part was worth more than force against the whole. She never forgot the way he said it, bent over the felt with a glass screwed into his eye. Find the one thing that failed, and the rest will forgive you. Her mother taught her a harder and quieter lesson out among the white hives at the edge of their land, where the bees moved in their thousands and a frightened person could get herself stung to death. Move slow, her mother would murmur. Breathe like you belong here, and the swarm will read your heart before it reads your hands. Marisol learned to stand inside a living cloud of them without flinching, and to know by the pitch of their humming whether they were content or about to turn. Between the clocks and the bees, she grew up believing 2 things. Few people around her believed, that what looked ruined usually only needed the right patience, and that fear was a language, and you could choose the words you spoke in it. She married Thomas Vane at 19, a soft-spoken man with a bad lung and a good heart who wanted land more than he wanted comfort, and the 2 of them went west with a wagon and a crate of her mother's bees and settled at last on a hard, honest quarter section outside a fading town called Canyon de Piedra, in the dry country where the mountains broke down into red rock and the river ran only when it felt like it. They built slow. They lost a first crop and a first child, and they kept building. Marisol mended every broken thing the neighbors brought her, clocks and locks and music boxes and the sad little mechanisms of oil lamps, and asked for eggs or flour in trade, and never once turned away a person who had nothing. Her bees thrived where nothing else would, and the honey she pulled from those hives was dark and strange and tasted of the desert flowers no one else could coax into bloom. And for a while, a good long while, the 2 of them were poor in money and rich in the only ways she had ever been taught to count. She did not know in those years that she was being prepared. She only knew she was happy, and that happiness, when you have it, rarely announces how thin the ice beneath it has become. The falling apart began the way most ruin begins, quietly, and with family. Thomas's younger brother, Silas Dune, came out from Kansas the 3rd year, all charm and borrowed money. And Thomas, whose lung was failing faster than he would admit, was so glad of blood beside him that he did not see what Marisol saw at once, a man who measured every room by what could be carried out of it. Silas smiled too easily and looked too long at the deed box on the shelf. When Thomas began to cough blood that last spring, it was Silas who insisted on managing the sale of the season's honey and the small herd, and Silas who returned with far less money than the goods were worth. and a story for every missing dollar. Marisol held her tongue for Thomas's sake, because a dying man should not be made to grieve his brother while he is busy grieving his own breath. Thomas died in June with his hand in hers, and he had believed, poor gentleman, that he was leaving her protected, because the deed to the ranch was in her name, and the law was the law. The law, it turned out, was only as strong as the nearest man willing to enforce it, and in Canyon de Piedra that summer, there was no such man. Silas moved fast. He produced a paper, badly forged, claiming Thomas had signed the ranch over to him weeks before he died, and when Marisol challenged it, the town's only magistrate, who owed Silas money and feared him besides, found reasons to look at his boots. Silas hired 2 rough men who had drifted in off the cattle trails, and one gray morning barely a month after the funeral, the 3 of them came to the house and told her she was trespassing on her own land. She fought them with words and then with a broom handle, and it changed nothing. They loaded her few belongings into the old wagon, almost gently, as though generosity in small things could excuse the great theft, and they drove her out toward the mouth of Coldwater Canyon under the pretense of taking her to the stage road. What they meant to do she did not understand until it was nearly done. At the high place where the track ran along the rim, one of the men cut the traces, and Silas himself set his shoulder to the wagon, and over it went, down the long red slope, and Marisol went with it into the rocks and the cold shadow at the bottom. And the last thing she heard from above was her brother-in-law telling the others, in the reasonable voice of a man closing a ledger, that the canyon took people all the time and no one would come asking. She did not die, though she gave the canyon every chance. She woke in the blue dark with a wrenched ankle and a gash along her scalp, and the wagon splintered around her, and her first clear thought, absurd and saving, was her mother's voice. Move slow. Breathe like you belong here. She did not weep. She took stock, the way her father had taught her to take stock of a broken clock, laying out what she had across the felt of her mind. She had $11 sewn into her hem, which the men had not thought to search. She had a wool blanket, a tin of matches gone half to water, a small folding knife, a comb, and the copper honey dipper her mother had given her, which she had gripped so hard through the fall that it had cut her palm. She had 2 good hands and a mind that did not know how to quit. For 3 days, she worked her way down the dry canyon toward the settled country, sleeping in rock hollows, eating the tasteless pads of prickly pear cut open with the folding knife, wrapping her ankle so tightly she could hobble on it. And as she walked, she did not plan revenge, because revenge takes a strength she did not yet have. She only fixed her mind on a single stubborn point of light. She would not give Silas Doon the tidy ending he had written for her. She would live, if only to spoil his arithmetic. She came out of the canyon at last into the near-dead town of Requa, a place even poorer than Canyon de Piedra, a played-out mining camp that had swelled to 2,000 souls in the silver rush of the 60s and shrunk to a scattered few hundred once the veins ran dry. Requa was a town of leaning porches and boarded windows, of an empty church and a schoolhouse with no children, of old men who sat in the shade remembering a boom that had left them nothing. Marisol had no name there and no story anyone wanted, a bruised widow with $11 and a limp, and she quickly learned that Requa's one obsession, the thing the old men circled back to like a sore tooth, was the legend of the Halloran Gang. 22 years before, so the story went, a band of road agents led by a soft-spoken killer named Cade Halloran had robbed the silver freighters that ran the canyon road, taken a fortune in bar silver and mined payroll gold and the good folks' savings besides, and vanished into the rock. A posse had cornered them somewhere in the maze of dry washes above the canyon and killed most of them in a running fight. But the loot was never found, and neither was Halloran's own body, and every dollar the gang had stolen came out of the pockets of Requa itself. The mine wages that never got paid, the church fund, the school teachers' savings, the money that would have carried the town through the bust. Requa had not just been robbed of coin, it had been robbed of its future, and it had spent 22 years too poor and too tired to ever get it by. With 4 of her $11, Marisol bought the thing that made the bank clerk laugh in her face. At the edge of Requa, half a mile up a dry side gulch that ran back toward the canyon, there was an old miner's dugout carved into the hillside. Its front timbers collapsed in a rockfall years before, its claim long abandoned as worthless. The bank held the deed against unpaid taxes of exactly $4, and no one in a generation had offered even that, because everyone knew the little mine had never produced more than heartache. The clerk counted her coins with 2 fingers as though they might be dirty, told her she was buying a grave with a door on it, and pushed the deed across without troubling to write the word congratulations on his face. Marisol thanked him without irony. She had chosen it for reasons that had nothing to do with silver. It was shelter she could hold in her own name, up a gulch where a beaten woman could be left alone to heal, with a spring of sweet water nearby and a south-facing slope where, come spring, she might set the one hive she still dreamed of building. She did not buy it hunting a fortune. She bought it because it was the only patch of earth on the round of the world that belonged to her, and a person who has lost everything will pay $4 for a place to simply exist without being pushed. She spent her first weeks in Requa making herself useful, because that was the only wealth she had ever really trusted. She mended the schoolmistress's stopped clock, and the storekeeper's broken scale, and the ancient music box that the saloon-keeper's dead wife had loved, and she asked for food and nails and lamp oil in trade, and slowly the town stopped seeing a bruised stranger and started seeing a pair of clever hands, and in her hours alone she went to work on the dugout itself, clearing the rockfall stone by stone, not for treasure but for room, hauling the fallen rubble out into the gulch so she could shore up the timbers and make the back chamber dry. It was patient, brutal, unglamorous labor, exactly the kind her whole life had trained her for. And she did it the way her father had taught her to open a clock, one small piece at a time, in order, with respect for the whole. On the 9th day, deep in the back of the dugout where the original miner had drifted a short tunnel into the hill, her digging bar struck something that did not ring like stone. She cleared the dirt away with her hands and found the corner of a timber that had been squared by a tool, not split by nature, and behind it, a seam of mortared rock where no rock had any reason to be mortared. Someone, long ago, had walled off the very back of that tunnel on purpose, and then let the front fall in to hide that they had done it. Marisol sat back on her heels in the lamplight, her mother's copper dipper hanging at her belt, and felt the old familiar quickening she used to feel when she knew a clock's true fault was finally under her fingers. She did not tell a soul. It took her 4 more nights to open the wall, working only after dark, so no curious neighbor would wonder at her labor, prying the mortared stones loose one at a time and stacking them soft as eggs. When the last stone came away, a breath of cold, dry, dead air rolled out over her, air that had been sealed since before she was widowed, before she was married, air with the faint mineral ghost of old smoke in it. She held the lamp into the gap, and its light fell first on a man. She nearly cried out, but he had been dead a very long time, no more now than dry bones and the rags of a long coat, sitting with his back against the rock wall as though he had simply chosen that spot to rest and never risen. And across his lap, held in the cradle of his arm bones, was a leather satchel gone, stiff as bored with age. Around him in the little sealed chamber were the reasons a whole town had grieved for 22 years. Canvas sacks stamped with the mark of the Requa Consolidated Mine, wooden strongboxes with the freight company's brand burned into the lids, and stacked along the back wall like cordwood, dulled to the color of old bone, the bars of silver that the Halloran gang had taken from the canyon road and carried into the rock and never carried out. She had bought for $4 the lost fortune of Requa, and she was sitting alone in the dark with the man who had died guarding it. She did not touch the silver that night, nor the gold she found in the strong boxes, nor even the strange, sad man against the wall. She touched only the satchel, easing it out of the cradle of his arms with an apology she spoke aloud without deciding to, and she carried it back to her lamp and opened it, and it was the satchel, more than all the metal in the world, that changed everything. Inside was a ledger, a thick book of accounts kept in a careful, laboring hand, and folded letters, and a hand-drawn map of the canyon washes, and a long confession written across the last pages of the ledger by a dying man who had walled himself in on purpose. The man against the wall was not Cade Halloran the killer. He was a young mine clerk named Elias Rourke, and his story, written in a failing hand by the light of a lamp he must have known would outlast him, was not the story Requa had told itself for a generation. Elias had not been an outlaw at all. He had been the mine's own bookkeeper, a quiet, honest boy who had discovered, weeks before the great robbery, that the true thieves of Requa were not road agents, but the mine's own owners and the freight company together, who had been skimming the payroll and the townsfolk's deposits for years and meant to blame a robbery for the missing money and let the town starve. Elias had gathered the proof, every falsified figure, every forged receipt, and he had tried to move the real silver and gold, the town's actual wealth, out of their reach before they could vanish it, meaning to give it back to the people it belonged to. But the owners had set the Halloran gang on him, and in the running fight through the washes he had been mortally wounded, and he had done the only thing left to a dying honest man. He had hidden the whole fortune where the thieves would never find it, walled himself in with it, because he could no longer walk, and written down the truth in the hope that someday, somehow, someone with clean hands would open the wall and give Requa back both its money and its good name. He had died believing no one ever would. Marisol read the confession 3 times through, sitting on the cold floor of the dugout beside the lamp, and something in her that had been frozen since the canyon began, slowly, to thaw. She understood at once what she was holding, and it was not a windfall. It was a trust. Here was a fortune large enough to make her rich beyond the reach of Silas Doon or anyone else forever, silver and gold enough to leave Requa in the night and never look at its ruined porches again. And here, in the same satchel, was the reason it could not be hers. Every bar and coin had a name on it, a widow's name, a miner's name, a schoolchild's name, the name of a town that had been robbed twice, once of its money and once of the truth about who had robbed it. Elias Rourke had died to protect not the metal but the meaning. She thought of her father bent over the felt, telling her that a thing is rarely broken all the way through, that you must find the one small piece that failed. Requa was not broken all the way through. It had only had its heart hidden from it, walled up in the dark, and here she sat with the wall already open. She did not sleep that night, but somewhere before dawn she made her decision, and it was the same decision Elias had made, and she made it as calmly as choosing a word inside a swarm. She could not simply walk into Requa and announce a fortune, and she knew it, because she had already learned in one bitter summer how fast strong men come for weak hands holding something worth taking, and she had a second, sharper fear. For tucked into the ledger's proof were the names of the mine's old owners, and one of those names had a living heir she knew too well. The freight company that had partnered in the theft 22 years ago had been bought, its debts and its secrets both, by the very family that had bred Silas Doon. His own uncle had been one of the men who set the Halloran gang on a boy for telling the truth. The rot that had killed Elias Rourke and the rot that had rolled her over a canyon rim were the same rot, 2 generations of the same greed. And if Silas ever learned what lay in her dugout, he would not hesitate to bury her beside the man who had guarded it. So she moved slow. She breathed like she belonged there. She told no one what she had found, and she began, quietly, to prepare the town to receive its own truth, in a way that could not be stolen a third time. The trouble came before she was ready, as trouble always does. Word travels in a dying town faster than in a living one, because the people have so little else to carry, and someone had noticed the widow up the gulch hauling stone by lamplight and buying candles by the dozen, and the whisper reached the wrong ear. Silas Doon, it turned out, had not simply forgotten her. He had heard she survived, and a survived widow with a grievance, and a deed forged in her dead husband's name was a loose thread he could not abide. He rode into Requa on a fine horse, with his 2 trail men behind him, wearing the easy smile of a man who owns more than he has yet collected, and he made inquiries, and the inquiries led him up the dry gulch, to a dugout he expected to hold nothing but a broken woman he could frighten into silence or into a grave. What he found was Marisol Vane standing in her own doorway, unafraid, with the sealed chamber at her back, and the whole terrible truth of his family's history written in a dead boy's hand not 30 feet behind her. He did not yet know what she had, but she saw in his face the instant he began to wonder why a woman he had left for dead looked at him, now not with fear, but with the steady, reading calm of someone standing inside a swarm, waiting to hear whether it will turn. He tried charm first, then threats, then the forged deed, spreading it on her rough table and telling the 2 men he'd brought that this trespasser had stolen a dead man's land. And Marisol, who had spent a lifetime learning that fear is a language and that force against the whole is worth less than patience with the one small failed part, did not reach for a weapon she did not have. She reached instead for the thing Silas could not survive. She told him, quietly, that she knew about the freight company, and about his uncle, and about a mine clerk named Elias Rourke who had died writing down every name. And she watched the blood go out of his face as he understood that the loose thread he had come to cut was holding up the whole rotten curtain of his family's fortune. He lunged for her then, and for the satchel he now knew must exist. And here the story turns on the two things her mother and father had taught her at the edge of a Missouri field a lifetime ago. She had not been idle in her weeks of healing. Along the sunny slope outside the dugout, she had rebuilt her hives from a wild swarm she'd coaxed and tended. And she knew, as few people on earth knew, exactly how to make a peaceable multitude turn. As Silas and his men crowded into the narrow gulch mouth, she moved slow and sure to the row of hives, breathing like she belonged there. And she did the one thing that reads to bees as the end of the world. She struck the hives hard and loosed them all at once into the still evening air. And then she walked calmly through the rising cloud that knew her and would not sting her toward the spring, while the three men who did not belong there, who moved fast and stank of fear and violence, were met by 10,000 small, furious defenders reading their hearts. It was not the bees alone that finished Silas Doon. It was that in his blind, swatting, screaming flight through a gulch he did not know, in the last blue light, running from a woman he could not understand, he ran the wrong way along the very rim above the very canyon into which he had once rolled her, and the ground he trusted gave way beneath his fine boots, and Coldwater Canyon, which he had once said took people all the time, took him. His two hired men did not wait to grieve. They rode, and they kept riding, and Requa never saw them again. She did not gloat over it, then or after. She sat by her spring in the cooling dark while the bees settled back to their hives, and she felt no triumph, only the vast quiet that comes when a long-wound spring finally lets go. Karma, her mother would have called it, though her mother used softer words. The canyon had simply balanced its own book, but the balancing of Silas Doon was the smaller half of what she had come to do, and the next morning Marisol Vane did the thing that made her, in the memory of that town, something close to a saint. She did not sell the silver quietly and slip away rich. She went down into Requa, and she called the people together in the empty church, the old miners and the widows and the schoolmistress with no children to teach, and she laid Elias Rourke's ledger open on the altar rail, where every soul could see it, and she read them the truth their town had been denied for 22 years, that they had never been robbed by strangers, that their own owners had stolen from them and let a good boy take the blame, and that the boy had died hiding their fortune not from them, but for them, waiting all these years in the dark for hands clean enough to give it back. Then she told them where it was and whose names were written on it, and that not one bar of it was hers to keep. It took the better part of a month to bring the fortune down out of the gulch and reckon it out honestly, and Marisol insisted it be done in the open, with the whole town as witness, so that no man could ever again vanish Requa's wealth into the dark. The silver and gold were more than enough to pay every wage the mine had cheated, to restore every deposit the bank had lost, to reopen the school and mend the church and buy seed and stock and second chances for 100 families who had spent a generation believing their poverty was simply their lot. The heirs of the men whose names filled Elias Rourke's ledger were pursued in the courts of the territory with that ledger as proof, and though justice moved slow, as it always does, it moved, and the last shreds of the fortune Silas Doon's family had built on a dead boy's blame were stripped away and returned to the town they'd been stolen from. As for Elias himself, Marisol would not let him be forgotten a second time. They carried his bones down out of the dark chamber where he had kept his lonely, faithful watch, and they buried him in the churchyard under a good stone that told the truth of what he was. Not an outlaw, but the one honest man in a den of thieves. And the schoolmistress taught the children, once there were children again, to lay desert flowers on his grave in the spring. Marisol took for herself only what Requa pressed into her hands and would not let her refuse. The little dugout claim made properly hers, a small, honest share. The town voted her by acclamation, and a name in that valley that no forged paper could ever take away. She was 41 years old, the winter they left her for dead at the bottom of Coldwater Canyon, and they had been so certain of their arithmetic. They took the deed and the horses and the good rifle, and they counted her as a spill already wiped up, a sum already closed. But they had made the one error that greedy men always make. They mistook what she carried for what she was worth. They saw a woman with $11 in her hem, and they did not see the daughter of a clockmaker who knew that nothing is ever broken all the way through, or the daughter of a beekeeper who knew that fear is a language and that a swarm reads your heart before your hands. They laughed when she paid $4 for a caved-in grave with a door on it, and they could not have dreamed that she was buying back the future of a whole forgotten town and the good name of a boy dead 22 years, and, though she never once went looking for it, a quiet and final justice for herself. That is the thing about the overlooked and the abandoned, the played-out claim and the beaten widow and the ruined little town at the dry end of the canyon. The world writes its price on them in pencil and calls it done. And every so often, someone patient enough to open the wall in the dark shows the world what it was really looking at all along. Settle in, the story began. And let us tell you about Marisol Vane. And now you know that the woman they left for dead is the one who gave a whole town back its life. Thank you for staying with us all the way to the end, and for sitting a while in the lamplight of a story about the things and the people the world was too quick to write off. If Marisol's story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that being cast aside is not the same as being finished. And tell us this before you go, because we truly want to know, what is a time in your own life when you found real value in something or someone that everyone else had already given up on? Leave it in the comments, and we will read every one. Until next time, stay close.